So I'm just going to try and give some practical examples of where we've used this. And this isn't a puff piece for the organisation I work for because, you know, I don't think we always do it right, and there are probably other things we could have been looking at, but it's just trying to give you an example of how we found sort of social harm an interesting way to look at things. Just a bit of water. So some of our work has been specifically critiquing criminal justice and its efficacy. So the first publication I was involved in working on looked at the justice gap. So the number of known offences and how many offences came to the attention of the criminal justice system or were dealt with through the criminal justice system. And it turned out it was massive, so we were just dealing with that tiny pinprick. And we released a report. It was mentioned in Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons. We had massive media hits with it. And I think it did sort of slightly change the way in which people talked about crime statistics, now understanding about kind of what that tells us. We also released this booklet, Criminal Obsession. So we cut down, we worked with the authors of Beyond Criminology, the book I was talking about, into social harm, and published a booklet on that. And we had quite a lot of interest from the BBC. It was one of our most downloaded publications. We always try to kind of encourage students to read it, lecturers to use it. It's freely available on our website, and that's something else we try to do, is just make all of our publications free. And then I'll just sort of list through kind of some other examples. So, a crisis of enforcement. So we published a briefing that showed that being a victim of a work-related fatality or injury is far more likely than experiencing conventionally defined measured violence and homicide. With great press coverage. It gave us an opportunity to work with trade unions. We had a parliamentary launch. We had a lot of interest from kind of organisations that were working to try and improve safety for people at work or people affected. This research also looked at kind of maybe if you were injured in a shop, so it wasn't necessarily just people that were working at the time. Another example, crime is in the air, looking at the impact of air pollution. Again, we had quite a lot of interest from that. But I would say, I guess these areas are probably familiar territory for most critical criminologists. I mean, none of this is particularly kind of revolutionary stuff, but our emphasis here was to try and highlight social harm without necessarily calling for greater criminalisation. So it wasn't about saying, look here. But that's something we kind of have ongoing discussion with in terms of authors that write for us and that we work with. Another publication we did was called How a Bank Crisis Can Break Your Heart, and it was looking at the impact of the recession and sort of what happened in terms of banking and how that was likely to have an impact in terms of heart disease, and kind of sort of drawing some of the links around that. That was published in The Lancet. So I guess, you know, what we've been trying to do is sort of challenge common sense notions of crime. How am I doing for time? You've got to stop back. Okay. So something else we did was kind of, which was a bit different from the research report publication, was we had a photography competition called What is Crime? And we asked people to challenge common sense notions about what crime was, and we publicised it widely. We had sponsorship from a national newspaper called The Independent. We had 326 entries, and we had an exhibition with over 40 prints. And it was just, you know, there were people involved from schools, from art colleges, and, you know, people that kind of often probably didn't really talk about crime in their courses, but kind of, it just gave people an opportunity to have a bit of a think. You know, and in the publicity we specifically said, we're not interested in, you know, just think of crime differently, think of harm differently, think of how you picture injustice. And I've just got a couple of examples here. This was one of the winners in the finance category, May's Legs, and this is a shot of the photo was taken by Davy Jones. And he says that her arthritis was due to the long hours that she'd worked over her lifetime. Not something you probably think of as crime, but kind of a really interesting way of... this is Dark Waters, and this is a contaminated river. And that won the environment category. So I guess what I'm trying to say is kind of thinking about concepts of crime, it's not just an academic exercise. I think often you kind of think if you want to talk about definitions and concepts, that's something that kind of academics can do in their journals and debate it. But I just think it's about identifying and debunking common sense myths around crime and criminal justice. And I think integral to this process is unpicking some of the assumptions that are pivotal to kind of current debates about crime and justice. And in particular, that crime is a major source of societal harm. I also think it's about trying to contextualise criminal harms against non-criminal harms, which is sort of some of the stuff we were doing about the kind of deaths at work. And these are just some of the examples of the kind of work that we've been publishing. And at one level, as I said, it's not particularly innovative, a report, a press release. But I think it's helpful in terms of trying to challenge the status quo and disrupting popular debates about crime and criminal justice. We haven't really been focusing on, we're not a campaigning organisation as such, but we found really good academic work that takes on some of the arguments and discussion about crime and harm and about the efficacy of criminal justice. And we've used our skills and connections in terms of media and policy networks to try to publish and promote these alternative and critical perspectives. And also as part of that work internally, we've been talking about the language that we use in our reports, and should we be talking about offenders? Should we be talking about prisoners? Is it, we always try to humanise it as much as possible that we're talking about people. So strategies. What I'm talking about here is twofold. The first is to challenge the basis upon which criminal justice operates. So mainly its focal point, which is crime, and through that challenge questions around power, race, class, gender, and in particular challenging definitions of crime and the assumptions upon which criminal justice system is based. And looking at things through a social harm lens is one way of doing this. I'm sure there are others. And the idea is to look at human needs and about how societies go about delivering on those human needs. The other thing is sort of trying to find alternative ways, that's through research methods, definitions, different ways of analysing and attempting to understand social problems outside of the kind of criminal justice lens that we often look at things. And this isn't just about trying to look for alternatives to custody, it's looking for alternative ways of organising communities, economies, institutions, and as sort of Angela Davis has argued, sort of trying to find something that doesn't necessarily fit the footprint of criminal justice. So just my final slide. So I'm sure most of what I've talked about here is familiar territory. Harms caused by the powerful and the partiality of criminal justice. But my reason for talking this through is to emphasise the importance of questioning the language we use, looking beyond and outside the prison gates when we think about opportunities for campaigning, research and policy work. And importantly, not to forget the work of Luke Halsman, that crime does not exist. CCJS isn't a particularly... We're not explicitly an abolitionist organisation, but we're not interested in looking at crime. We haven't been trying to find out how to make the criminal justice system work better. But what we've been interested in doing is looking at harm instead of crime, social justice instead of criminal justice, and challenging the myths and misconceptions around criminal justice and its efficacy, and importantly trying to use evidence to do this. And I'd argue in favour of a perspective that relocates our understanding of harmful experiences outside of the criminal justice arena. And this just gives us a much kind of broader scope and reach for potential solutions. And I'll finish now, but I'd be really interested to hear, if you've got questions about social harm approach or just, ideas or strategies that come from this or other approaches that you're familiar with. So yeah, thank you. Thank you.